Welcome to another Bio 151 lecture. A few announcements before we get started. Sapling chapters 44 and 45 are due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. and office hours are via Zoom on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 3. To access the Zoom office hours, please see our Canvas page for the Zoom link. Today we're going to be talking about species interactions and communities. So species living in an ecosystem interact with each other in different ways. For example, you typically would think a shark would want to eat these fish that are cleaning its mouth. But this is actually a cleaning station, which is a location where aquatic life, whether marine or freshwater, congregate to be cleaned by smaller creatures. So in this mutualistic relationship, the smaller fish that normally could be food are actually getting food from the shark, and the shark is cleaned of any parasites or debris that might be stuck between its teeth or parasites that are on its body. So both organisms benefit from this interaction. Other interactions end up not being so great for one of the individuals. For example, in parasitism, we have a parasitoid cuckoo wasp, and they lay eggs on caterpillars. And then the larvae of the wasps eat the inside of the caterpillar, so the caterpillar ends up dying. So that's a relationship where one organism benefits, but the other does not. Here's an example of a mutualistic relationship. So you have a zebra and oxpecker birds. And these oxpeckers eat ticks and other parasites off of the zebra, so the oxpeckers are getting food while the zebra is getting cleaned of ectoparasites that could potentially transmit a disease and make the animal sick. So both organisms benefit. In a commensalism relationship, one organism benefits and the other does not benefit, nor is it harmed. So for example, on these humpback whales, you can see here these barnacles that are on the underside of the whale's mouth. The barnacles hitch a free ride and get brought to areas that are high in food resources, but the whales are not affected either positively or negatively. And finally, we have herbivory, where, for example, the sloth is eating a plant. So the sloth benefits by getting food, and the plant is harmed. So there's many different types of interactions that can happen between different species within an ecosystem. So let's think about a community. A community is the multiple species that occur together at any particular locality. So when we're talking about the different interactions between species today, we're thinking about them at a community level. Or we're thinking about community ecology, which is the interaction among different community members. A habitat is the place where organisms live, and the ecosystem is the combination of the community and the habitat. So if we want to think about this from smallest to largest, we have our individual, which is just one organism, and then we have our population. And the population is all of the organisms of the same species living within the same area. That population is part of the greater community of all the living plants and animals in that area, and the ecosystem is all of the organisms plus all of the physical or abiotic environment. Not every organism can survive and thrive throughout the entirety of the ecosystem. A niche is the total of all the ways an organism utilizes the resources of its environment. A niche is determined by both the physical or abiotic parameters and the biological or biotic factors based on interactions with other species. So for example, if we're thinking about plants, some plants are able to deal with soil that is more dry because they're more resistant to drought. So in an ecosystem, there might be specific areas in the habitat where the soil is drier. So certain plants that can handle that abiotic parameter of being in a more dry soil will be found in that area, where other species that are not able to deal with that dry soil will not be found there. So that's an example of how an abiotic parameter will determine the niche of a plant. If we're thinking about animals, such as these red-winged blackbirds, in this first picture here, these red-winged blackbirds are found throughout the entirety of the marsh. They're able to utilize all of the resources in that entirety of the marsh. That is their fundamental niche. The fundamental niche includes the full range of climate conditions and food resources that permit the individuals in a species to live. In nature, many species do not occupy all the habitats permitted by their anatomy and physiology because of interactions with other species. These interactions can reduce the range that's actually occupied through competition or predation. So the actual range of habitats occupied by a species is called the realized niche. So we could see in the second picture, when red-winged blackbirds have to compete for resources against these yellow-headed blackbirds, they're the less competitive species. So they get moved out of the center of the marsh, which has the most resources. So their realized niche is on the outskirts of the marsh, even though their fundamental niche is across the entirety of that habitat. Competition is a main driving factor that determines the size of an organism's realized niche. Interactions due to competition can lead to adaptations, which are the products of natural selection that allow different species to coexist by exploiting different combinations of resources. So if we look at this example for competition, competition occurs when organisms attempt to utilize the same resource. So in competition, organisms are fighting against each other to try to attempt to get that resource, whether it's the resource for space or for food. Intra-specific competition is competition between individuals of a single species. So even though you're a member of one species, you still have to compete against the other individuals in the population that you're living in for access to food resources. Interspecific competition occurs when different species interact. So in this example, we have two different bivalves, and we have the fundamental niche of the thalamus. And you can see that on this tidal rocky slope, their fundamental niche is the entirety of this tidal zone, from low tide all the way up to high tide, which means that individuals in this particular population are able to withstand the desiccation or drying out during the periods of low tide. When a second group or a second species, the Balanus, is introduced, they outcompete through interspecific competition the thalamus, and so you can see that the area that the thalamus is found is much smaller in the places where there's competition between these two species. So we can see that the fundamental niche for thalamus is much larger than its actual realized niche, or the area that it's actually found. Whereas the superior competitor, the Balanus, its fundamental niche and realized niche are the same because it has outcompeted the inferior competitor. And what occurs then is, by not being able to access these resources, the thalamus has been competitively excluded from that habitat, which means that no two species utilizing the same niche can coexist indefinitely with limited resources. One species will eventually eliminate the other through competition. So in this example, the thalamus is able to withstand a much more longer period of desiccation or lack of being underwater compared to the balanus. So this adaptation of being able to withstand drying out longer allows this species to stay in this range where the superior balanus competitor cannot access. And this shift in the location that you find these two organisms is called character displacement. So competitive exclusion played out over time results in initially similar species diverging in habitat use and feeding strategies. Resource partitioning is the process by which species whose niches overlap diverge over time and become different subspecies or species. The result is that the overlap, that competition between closely related species is minimized. So if we want to think of it graphically, we have an orange species and a blue species, and these bell curves are the resources that that particular species can consume if we're thinking about food. And we can see that there's this overlapping competition here between this particular resource. What will happen over time is that you will have divergence, and the two species will diverge or become different in the resources that they use. This way, there is a reduction in competition between the two species because they're moving from their fundamental niches to their realized niches. And we can see this with Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Island. When either of these two finches are the only finch species on the island, you can see that they have very similar beak lengths for eating seeds. And so you could see here that they're eating very similar seeds and their beaks are similarly shaped. When they're found on islands together, what happens is you have this resource partitioning and you have one species moving towards larger beaks so it can eat larger seeds, and the other species having a smaller beak and moving towards smaller seeds. So this is scientifically showing what's happening in these graphs. So over time, the species will end up separating so that they are using different resources. So they're realizing their niche because of competition. So our first question for today, measuring its costs and benefits in terms of energy spent and or gained, competition among individuals results in A, a loss for both individuals, B, a gain for both individuals, C, a gain for one individual and a loss for the other, or D, a gain for one individual and neither a gain nor a loss for the other. And think about this closely. Think about competition. So pause the video and answer the first question below. Our second question for today. When two species compete for similar resources, resource partitioning can alter the niche of the species that compete. Resource partitioning results in A, individuals of each species sharing the resource that they both exploit, B, individuals of each species hybridizing in the region of overlap, C, a move from the fundamental niche to the realized niche for both species, or D, a move from the realized niche to the fundamental niche for both species. So pause the video and answer the second question below. So now we're going to talk about different interactions that species can have within a community. The first species interaction is predation. And predation is an interaction you are probably familiar with. It's a type of interaction in which one organism consumes another. So the predator benefits at the expense of the prey because the predator gets food and the prey is eaten. Predators can limit the population sizes of their prey which will prevent prey populations from increasing to the level where competitive exclusion occurs. This competition reduction allows species to overlap in niches without excluding one another. So here's an experiment that some scientists did. They looked at 3 different species of toads. First, they looked at the southern toad, and then they looked at the eastern spadefoot toad, and finally the spring peeper. The spring peeper is a very small in size compared to the other 2 species. And what they saw is that in the presence of the 2 larger toad species but no predators, the spring peeper tadpoles compete poorly for food compared to the 2 larger species. As a result, they have low survival rates, and those individuals that do make it to maturity are often undersized because as tadpoles, they did not have access to adequate nutrition. But when the biologist added new predators, they saw something happen. In the presence of a predatory red-spotted newt, the tables are turned. The newt prefers to eat the larger tadpole species, which prevents them from becoming sufficiently abundant to outcompete the smaller spring peeper tadpoles. The spring peeper tadpoles then have the highest survival rates. So when you have the most predators, you have the smallest toads having the highest survival rate. That's because there's a reduction in the competition for food, which allows these small tadpoles to access the food and then when they become adults have a maximal body size. So you can see here that in this example, this competition reduction allowed the spring peeper to survive at higher rates. Another species interaction that's similar to predation is herbivory, and that's the consumption of plant parts directly affects the products of photosynthesis, removing them from plant productivity and making them available to animals and other consumers. Plants are not passive victims to herbivores. They have evolved defenses to defend themselves from herbivores. For example, they might have appearance defenses. So sensitive plants, such as these ones up here, when the leaves are touched by any organism, the leaf itself closes up. And this is to mimic a dead leafless plant, so we can have mimicry in plants. Another appearance defense is camouflage. So stone plants avoid herbivores by blending in with their environment. So if you look at this first picture, you might not know where the plants are, but they've been circled here for you to see. And so by having camouflage, they're able to protect themselves against herbivores. There's morphological defenses, which are thorns, spines, different physical morphological defenses that make it more challenging for herbivores to actually access the plant. And then there's also chemical defenses. So some plants can secrete chemicals that are defensive compounds. So if you have a caterpillar here and it eats a plant, the plant can secrete direct chemical defenses that might make the caterpillar sick or might make the plant not taste good. And that's a way to deter herbivores from eating the plant. Another thing that the plant can do is when it's damaged by herbivores is release an attractant chemical, which will then bring predators of those insect herbivores, such as ants, and then the ants themselves will defend the plant against the herbivore. So there's different ways that plants have evolved to help protect themselves. A symbiosis is a relationship, a permanent relationship between 2 or more kinds of organisms. And this can be a mutualistic, parasitic, or commensalistic relationship. And all symbiotic relationships carry the potential for coevolution. And this is because these organisms are living together in a permanent relationship. And so over time, adaptations occurring between these two organisms can have coevolution. And this is a table from your book showing the effects on each species for different types of interactions. So the first type of symbiotic relationship we're going to talk about is mutualism. And mutualism, in a mutualistic relationship, both participants benefit. The benefits outweigh their costs. There's two different types of mutualistic relationships. There's obligate, where one or both sides of a mutualistic relationship cannot survive without the other. The other is facultative, and that's where one or both can survive without the other. So for example, for facultative, an example that I showed you was with the oxpecker birds on the zebra. That's a facultative relationship. The oxpeckers can hunt for insects and other arthropods in other ways, and the zebras would be okay having some ticks on them, but that mutualistic relationship benefits them so much that it's a relationship that occurs. When we're thinking about mutualism, it's important to remember that each side is acting in its own self-interest. That means that it bears costs for being in this relationship, but the benefits outweigh those costs. So here's an example of a mutualistic relationship. Here we have aphids, which are these black insects here, and you can see that they don't have wings and they're relatively defenseless against predators. So what the relationship is that we have aphids with ant herders. So you could think of these ants as shepherds for their aphid flock. In this relationship, the aphids are protected from predators because the ants will actually chase away predators, and the ants receive food from the aphids. So as the aphids drink from the sap of the plants, they excrete honeydew, which is a very highly concentrated sugary substance. So the ants get a high energy meal from protecting the aphids. So that is a mutualistic relationship where both groups are benefiting. The next type of species interactions is parasitism. And parasites live in close association with another species, gaining nutrition by consuming the host's tissues. Parasites commonly do not kill their hosts, but they can reduce the host's fitness by tapping into its resources. This can limit the population size of a host, which will keep the numbers well below the carrying capacity of the environment, which allows multiple organisms then to share in different niches by reducing competition. There's two different types of parasites. There's ectoparasites and endoparasites. Ectoparasites are external parasites such as lice, ticks, mosquitoes. Parasitoids are a specific type of ectoparasite, and parasitoids lay eggs on living hosts. So an example of a parasitoid was that blue metallic cuckoo wasp that had laid its eggs on that caterpillar. Endoparasites are internal parasites, and we've talked about some endoparasites already this semester when we talked about nematodes from our animal diversity lecture. Now you might be wondering why this very adorable, fluffy, bumblebee-like insect is on the slide about parasites. Well, this is one of my favorite insects, and it is not a bumblebee. It is actually a fly. It is a deer botfly, and botflies are parasites. They're actually parasitoids. They lay their eggs on living hosts. They're larvae, which these are the different stages of larval development for this deer botfly. The larvae then burrow into the tissue of the host, either into its skin, or in this example, they go into its nasal cavity. And these larvae then burrow in, and you can see right there, those are its mouth parts. You can also see them here. And they burrow into the skin and they liquefy the tissue around them and eat it. And that's how they get their nutrients. And you can see it's very difficult to get a botfly larvae out because it has these backward facing hooks. So it's very challenging to pull it out of the skin, even if it is on the external part of the animal. So we're going to see two cross sections. One is going to be a cross section having to do with endoparasites, and the other will be a cross section of a deer head. So you can see what it looks like when these deer botflies are in the nasal cavity. So you can see here's our nasal cavity, and here are all the botflies that are infested inside that nasal cavity of that deer. Now there's many different botflies. There are ones that actually lay their eggs and the larvae develop on the outside of the skin as well. And not all of them are as cute as this one, but that one is just so cute. Here's an example of endoparasites. So these are roundworms, and this is the small intestine of a horse. And I said that parasites commonly do not kill their hosts, but if an infestation of parasites gets too large, such as in this example, usually horses have a few roundworms, not this many. If the infestation gets too large, they can kill their host, which is then not good for the host nor the parasite because the parasite is not able to fulfill its life cycle. So this is an extreme example of roundworms found in a horse's small intestine. The last type of species interaction is the one that is the most rare in nature, and this is commensalism. In commensalism, one species benefits while the other is neither helped nor harmed. So we already saw one example with the barnacles on the humpback whales. The barnacles get a benefit, they get a free ride and access to highly food-rich areas in the ocean, and the whales don't get anything. Here's another example, and this is an example where we have cattle egrets, which are the white birds, and cattle. And cattle egrets hang out around cattle, and they eat the insects that fly up because they're disturbed by the cattle eating the grass. The cattle do not get anything from it, but the egrets get a meal. This could easily change into a mutualistic relationship if, for example, the cattle egrets started to signal when there was a predator around. So then the cattle were aware of that and knew to move to a safer location. So that is why commensalism relationships are so rare in nature, because what typically happens is over time, a more mutualistic relationship develops. So time for your next questions. Most symbiotic interactions require a long-term association between the two species. Which of the interactions is not a symbiotic association? A. Photosynthetic algae living with a fungus as a lichen. B. A lion that eats a small antelope in the open grasslands. C. Leafcutter ants that supply food to their fungal gardens. Or D. Ants that live on a host tree and chew off branches of neighboring trees that grow too close. So pause the video and answer the third question below. All right, next question. Lampreys, which are one of the groups of jawless fish that we talked about when we talked about animal diversity, have sucker-like mouths and are known to attach themselves to fish. In doing so, they rasp off a section of the fish using their hard, keratinized structures in the mouth and feed on the blood and fluid that oozes into their oral cavity. Fish can survive with a lamprey attached, but they have to expend extra energy swimming with the lamprey attached. This association would be designated A. Commensalism, B. Mutualism, C. Parasitism, or D. Predation. Pause the video and answer the fourth question below. All right. So biodiversity is the biological diversity of an area. It's often calculated by counting the number of species that are in that area. That could be very challenging if you're in a place that has a lot of species diversity, so there's many species. So what ecologists do a lot of the time is that they actually count the number of plants, since they're not mobile, and then they can do math to figure out how many species of arthropods, of birds, of mammals, etc. there are in the area. A keystone species is a species that has a disproportionate effect on the community relative to its abundance. Keystone species can influence the transfer of a large proportion of biomass and energy across trophic levels. They can also modify their physical environment. Without a keystone species in that environment, if that keystone species, for example, goes extinct, the ecosystem that it's a part of can be completely destroyed. So, for example, along the west coast of the United States and Canada, giant kelp can grow to more than 50 meters tall, providing a home for a remarkable diversity of fish and invertebrates. These kelp forests are some of the most biodiverse habitats in the world. The kelp community depends strongly on a single predator, the sea otter. Sea otters are the predators of sea urchins. Sea urchins graze on the root-like holdfasts that anchor the kelp to the sea floor. When the sea urchins eat through those holdfasts, the kelp then flows away due to the ocean currents, and that forest is destroyed. When the otters are removed by overhunting, sea urchin abundance can soar and the kelp can nearly disappear. Many of the organisms that rely on the kelp, either for food or for protection from predators, also disappear. So when there's sea otters in the area, you can see in this picture, there could be over 20 different species living in this particular kelp forest. But when the sea otters are gone, these sea urchins multiply because they don't have a predator and they destroy the kelp forest. So in this example where the sea otters are not present, there might be 5 to 7 species surviving. So you could see how the removal of one species, the sea otter, that keystone species, can totally decimate an ecosystem. Sometimes ecosystems are decimated by environmental changes. So a disturbance such as a fire or a tree falling down or a flood or even human interactions such as clear-cutting a forest for farmland or building a road, these disturbances can have major effects on populations of interacting species. Disturbances affect species regardless of the density of that species because the disturbance affects all organisms in the environment equally. Following a disturbance or the appearance of a new habitat, so the appearance of a new habitat would be, for example, there's a volcanic eruption in the ocean and the volcano erupts so much that it forms a new island in the ocean. So that's an example of appearance of a new habitat. A community goes through a series of changes. These changes involve succession, which is a predictable sequence of species that colonize and then transform the community in what can appear to be a very linear process of maturation. So, for example, if we had a flood come through and decimate our ecosystem, so now we're down to bare rock, the first group of organisms that would come in and colonize that bare rock are lichens, mosses, and small invertebrates. And this is called primary succession. Primary succession occurs in bare or open areas. And these are the first organisms to colonize a newly disturbed habitat. Over time, after these populations get high enough, you then will have secondary succession. And secondary succession involves the colonization by small plants and animals, which are typically our strategists. The plants help to keep the soil stable. The soil has been slowly formed by lichens and mosses and the decay of these small invertebrates. So now we have soil, and these new plants help to keep the soil in place. Over time, hardier plants can then occur, and K strategists start to colonize later. Once you have enough biodiversity and good enough soil, you can reach a climax community, which are stable communities that occur as a result of succession in an undisturbed area. So after our disturbance over a long period of time, you can then have your climax community. So in this example, it would be a typical forest that we think of today. So it takes a long time for those communities to occur, and they're very biodiverse and have a combination of R and K strategists. One way that we can measure how biodiversity changes is by looking at islands, because islands represent extremes in habitat patchiness for colonizing species, because an organism must successfully cross a barrier of water to establish a new population on an island. Ecologists commonly use the term island to include any habitat patch that is surrounded by inhospitable environment. An inhospitable environment is just an environment that a particular species has a very challenging time surviving in. So for example, a lake surrounded by land. If you are a frog and you want to move from one lake to another, it might be very inhospitable for you to travel across the land because there's a high chance that you will dry out. So the land is inhospitable for that frog species. Another example is a forest surrounded by grasslands. If you're a small prey animal, the forest might provide protection from certain predators such as hawks. To travel from one forest patch to another between grasslands might be very challenging because the hawk is more likely to see you when you're going through the grassland. Another example are mountaintops. So if you live at a high altitude, for example, in an alpine field, to get from one mountaintop alpine field to another mountaintop is very challenging because you need to travel. If you can't fly, you have to travel through a forest at a lower elevation. Species diversity reflects both the rate at which new species arrive on an island and the rate at which species already on the island become extinct. So over time, the rate of new arrival will reach an equilibrium, and the extinction rate on the island will reach an equilibrium, and that equilibrium S will be the number of species that we can hypothesize to find on a particular island. Certain abiotic parameters affect the number of species or the biodiversity that we expect to find on islands. The theory of island biogeography states that the number of species that can occupy a habitat island depends on two factors: the size of the island and its different distance from the colonists. So we're first going to talk about island size, and then we're going to talk about island distance. So if we look at this figure here, on our x-axis, we have our number of species on the island, going from 0 to a large number. On our y-axis, we have our rate of extinction or immigration. So the closer to 0 we are, the lower the rate, and the further away from 0, the higher the rate. First, we're going to look at extinction. So if we follow the two lines for extinction, we can see that our small island has a higher rate of extinction compared to our large island. And this is because on smaller islands, there's less resources. So competition for those resources is much higher. because you have high levels of competition, you're more likely to have competitive exclusion. Because an island that's small has such finite resources, a lot of times that competitive exclusion leads to extinction of certain species on the island. A larger island has more resources, so the extent of competition is reduced. So you have lower levels of extinction. Also, immigration on a larger island is going to be much higher than immigration to a small island. And that's because organisms that are traveling across that barrier, whether it be water or whatever, it's going to be easier for them to randomly find a larger island compared to a smaller island. So if you're larger, it's much easier to find. So for example, think about if you're throwing a ping pong ball. It's going to be a lot easier to throw a ping pong ball and get that ping pong ball to land in a giant bucket than it would be to get it to land into a small mug. Same idea, when you're migrating across an open area, it's going to be a lot easier to find and run into that larger island than it would be for that smaller island. So what that means, that combination means that smaller islands will have less species on them because they have a higher rate of extinction and a lower rate of immigration. Whereas large islands have a smaller rate of extinction and a higher rate of immigration, so large islands will have a greater number of species. Distance is a similar thing. So in this example, our islands are the same size, they're just different distances from the mainland. So because they're the same size, our rate of extinction is the same for these two islands because competition is even, because the same amount of resources are available. But immigration to a far island is much less compared to immigration to a near island. And so let's go back to that ping pong example. If you had a giant bucket and you got to stand 2 feet away from the bucket, you're much more likely to get the ping pong ball into the bucket compared to if you have to stand 15 feet away from the bucket. It's going to be more challenging to make that basket. It's the same idea if you are migrating to a new area. You're more likely to find that island that's closer first, and you're more likely to survive that journey. So islands that are closer to the mainland are going to have a much greater number of species compared to islands that are further away. So we're going to do our last 2 questions for today. When beavers are present in a forest community, there are more than 15 fish species found in that community. If beavers are removed, there are only 5 to 7 fish species that remain. These data suggest that beavers are A, a keystone species, B, top predators, C, primary consumers, or D, secondary consumers. So pause the video and answer the 5th question below. And our last question for today. Consider the location of islands off the coast of a mainland, which is the source of the colonizing species. Which of the islands in the picture below will have the highest biodiversity? Is it island H, K, L, or M? Pause the video and answer your 6th question below. All right, and one last cool species interaction for you today. This organism below is called a carrier crab, and this carrier crab is typically found carrying a sea urchin on top of its body. And this is a mutualistic relationship. The crab gets protection by the sea urchin by having all these spikes protecting it, so predators are less likely to eat the crab. And the sea urchin gets a free ride to new food sources. So a cool mutualistic relationship. If you have any questions, post in the discussion board, email me, or attend the Zoom office hours Tuesdays and Thursdays. And do not forget to submit your clicker questions below. Have a great